Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm really glad you could all join us. I'd like to thank you for attending and hope that you're all doing well. Unfortunately, one of our guests today can't join us. John Stinson is unfortunately feeling under the weather, like many of us can be at this time of year, so gives us apologies for today. Believe it or not, this is our 16th and final webinar of 2022 and our third round panel discussion. To date, our webinars, I believe, have well in excess of 120,000 views. So if you're attending this as your last webinar of the year, thank you for supporting us, and we hope to see you next year. We have a number of special panelists here who will introduce themselves shortly. And if you have any questions around Retrofit for the future, please email us at webinar@proctorgroup.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at @proctorgroup. You can also pop your questions right here in the chat box below the video feed. If you've registered, you'll receive a follow-up email with all of these links and a link to the replay. And late registration is also still open for this week's webinar if you want the replay link. Just as an aside, it really helps us if you enjoy today's webinar, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So we're posting a lot of videos on there, informative installation information, what's coming up, etc. So if you subscribe, you won't miss anything. So if we can just start by introducing our panelists, please. If I can jump in and ask Steve to introduce himself, that would be great. And quick thoughts on also the topic of Retrofit for the future, Steve.
Hi, my name is Steve Hodgson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Property Care Association. We represent contractors, surveyors, and manufacturers that are essentially operate around the realms of dampness in buildings. I've worked on several British standards, some of which relate back to Retrofit. I'm currently working on one that's allied to 2035 that should be out hopefully next year on pre-installation stuff. But my kind of slightly unhealthy obsession that's cropped up around all things Retrofit comes from really a number of different places. The first is that I absolutely am committed to the fact that we have to, do more to reduce our carbon impact. We have to do more to make our buildings more efficient and keep them relevant for the future. But I'm really concerned that sometimes we rush into these amendments to buildings in ways that we don't completely understand. Retrofit changes the way the buildings operate. And I worry that we don't necessarily go into it always with our eyes wide open. And we don't really understand the moisture risks that arise as a direct result of some of the interventions that we're seeing. I'm also very worried too about the growing amount of negative press comment around Retrofit. The article last week on ITN saying there were 2 million buildings with defective EWI was totally incorrect, and is a challenge to us all if we're actually trying to drive forward this agenda. So I'm very interested in a future where Retrofit is done well, at high quality, and is done sustainably, and we can build an industry rather than move in short, sharp, jerky movements, getting it wrong and getting it right, and nobody knows quite what they're buying. So that's me, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. Jeff, can I ask you to do the same, please? Just introduce yourself and a quick overview of your thoughts on the topic.
Sure, Keira. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Jeff Colley. I am the publisher and editor of Passive House Plus, which is a sustainable building magazine that's published for the last 10 years in 2 editions, a UK edition and an Irish edition. I've actually been publishing a sustainable building magazine of one name or another since 2003. So I've been at this a long time. And over that time, I guess we've seen a lot of projects, a lot of retrofit projects and new build projects, and we've learned an awful lot, I suppose, just through hanging around these projects and through writing about them, about what has worked and what hasn't. In particular through waiting a while to feature a project until you actually have some post-occupancy data and some feedback from the occupants, and that's what ultimately drove us in the direction of the Passive House standard as the kind of approach that we wanted to emphasize. What I would say really is that I mean, the energy crisis that we're going through right now and the climate crisis, they demand urgent action, but there are risks and we can't afford to make mistakes. So we must adopt evidence-based, building physics-based approaches to retrofit. And we must put measures in place to ensure that buildings are designed and constructed to balance energy performance, thermal comfort, indoor air quality, and the minimization of interstitial condensation risk, alongside all the other kind of concerns you'd have when you're doing works to a building, make it kind of people-centered and so on. But we need to be pragmatic about this. So Enerfit, the passive house standard for retrofits, is fantastic, but it's not always going to be the right solution for every retrofit, depending on budget, depending on the existing building, and so on. But I think we need to look at. I would take particular heart from the likes of the AECB standards, the Association for Environment Conscious Buildings retrofit standards, which are built using essentially the same engine as Enerfit and the same thinking, but with slightly less onerous targets. So I think there's a spectrum approach there, which I look towards. But irrespective, evidence-based, I think is the approach that I would really want to be talking about today.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Morning, Christina.
Thanks, Keira. Hi, my name's Christina Gaiger, and I am an architect at Helen Lucas Architects in Edinburgh and the immediate past president of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, known as the RIS. And I'm really grateful to the team at Proctor for inviting me along today. I'm just always really excited to see more and more discussion in the industry and beyond on retrofit. I think for a long time, for many reasons, it's been the real elephant in the room when talking about construction and the climate emergency. I think a lot of people don't know how to deal with it. There have been problems in the past. So do we ignore it? It's easier to ignore it. So I think the momentum in the industry is really encouraging, which is great to see. But, as Jeff said, at the moment, we've also got the cost of living crisis on our hands. Therefore, it becomes even more pertinent. And I think the pandemic played a role in that because people became aware of the surroundings more than ever before, because we were stuck, immersed in them. And then now, with the cost of that associated with it as well becoming, increasingly on our minds, it's a really, really key time. And I think, therefore, the awareness of it is kind of exponentially growing. I'm going to be quite broad brush in my overview, because the crazy thing, despite that, is that retrofit isn't something new. So although it's everywhere, it's a buzzword, it's become this kind of hot topic, it's not new. Architects, the industry as a whole, have been improving the performance of existing buildings for years. It's what I do, it's what a lot of us do every day. So one could ask, why is it such a hot topic? And it is because of the climate emergency and the cost of living and the focus on, government targets to hit net zero and reducing home energy costs. So it's become critical. But the confusing thing that I always really find is that the industry still, in the majority, continues to build at a lower standard than what we are able to, or what will be required. Therefore, we're almost inducing future retrofit, which is kind of crazy, for years to come, on top of what we already have in our existing building stock, where, there is work being done, but there's no real program or system to support households and address the needs of our current housing stock and their occupants, which, the homeowner and the household is the key in this. And I think that kind of people-centered approach, to use those words again that Jeff uses, is really important. And I mean, that just comes from not being able to heat your home is an absolutely terrifying concept, psychologically and from a health kind of perspective as well. So providing the means to eradicate that for future generations to come is really empowering, nationally. And there's so much opportunity and work to be done there. And there's a lot of expertise and experience to bring to the table on it, which is some of which are here today, which is great to see. So to sum up, although it's an old concept, we're still building to require reliance on it. So in terms of the climate emergency and again, the cost of living, it's just way more important than ever before. So great to be here and having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Iain.
Morning, Keira. Morning, everybody. Great introduction from everybody in the panel here. Really looking forward to this. It should be really interesting to hear what everybody's got to say. I mean, it's something, retrofit is something that we're very concerned about, climate change, and how we're going to correct that. And just as Christina said, the energy crisis is one of the things that is driving this. For years, I've told my fellow board members that thermal insulation improvements to your house is not a dinner subject. Unfortunately, you can't tell people, oh, it's great, come and have a look at how much insulation I've used in my walls. It's not a topic that most people use. Maybe at my parties, it might be slightly different, but yeah, it's not particularly sexy, but it's very pertinent at the moment. It's a massive challenge that the construction industry's got ahead of them. Some scary figures. 1.5 million, 1.5 minutes per house has to be refurbished, which is really scary. But the great point that Jeff made about balance, and I was really pleased that that word's been used so quickly in this. It is all about balance. It's a complicated issue, refurbishment. I never got it at college that much about refurbishment. And when I was at college, you just put more insulation in and never really worried about condensation. Now you have to worry about the whole heat, air, moisture circle of balance. And I think it's really important. So looking forward to today, Keira, and let's see what the comments bring.
Absolutely. Well, we have a lot of good questions which have come in via email even before this morning, and I can see more coming through now. So please bear with me. And as I say, if you have any, particularly if you want to direct them to a particular judge, please just note that if you do it on Twitter or email or on the YouTube feed, and I can make sure I can direct those. Judges, I'm just going to go through the questions and kind of ask you at random. If you have something to add to someone else's answer, please do so. Just pop your hand up. And please feel free to jump on the back of someone else's comment. We want to hear what everyone's got to say about everything, really. So if I can just start, Steve, we have a good question here from Rory around retrofit. So should retrofit be a specialist occupation, or can we encourage everyone in the RMI sector to deliver retrofit as part of their everyday work?
Right. I think it's a really good question. I wish I'd have answered that. I couldn't have seeded that better myself. I'm absolutely convinced that for the design and for the concept of retrofit, actually you need to think in a way that you have good understanding of all the implications of what you're doing, and therefore there is a requirement for a specialist to understand and provide that information. However, what I know is happening with organisations like the Department of Education is they're looking at the requirements for that, 1.5 buildings a minute or whatever it is by 2035, 2050, and are absolutely convinced that the workforce isn't there. So we're looking at skilling up and stealing workers from other places to throw them at the retrofit industry. Now, I'm not sure that that's the best way to do it. My own thought is that actually, as the part of anybody's refurb, repair, interventions with their properties, extensions, why can't we have a workforce that can actually also bring in insulation measures and retrofit measures as part of that overall kind of suite of things that they just do? Why would you have to, if you're improving the thermal elements of a building, why don't you do it all? Why don't you extend that scope of that work from beyond the thing that you've built to the other elements of the building? So I think personally that there's this kind of I think there's potential for a very virtuous circle where we have subspecialists that can be accessed, that can be used to put plans together, that can be used to coordinate risk and coordinate programs, but we actually take some of that, if you like, the handwork out of those specialist sectors and actually allow and empower general construction workers to do some of that as part of their services. The real killer, though, and I come back to it all the time, is detailing. We must understand that when we're doing retrofit, the devil is always in the detail, whether it's moisture risk, whether it's thermal performance, and actually that's one of the things that often we see in the general construction sector, that actually we don't think enough about that detail.
Thank you, Steve. That's fantastic. Christina, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that this is the first question, so it's a great place to start, because it's part of the how, how on earth do we tackle this? And I think it's really interesting that, the design and that detail came up so quickly as well, because that is key. And I think often in the industry, that design step has often been missed in the past. So it's been just materially applied or manufacturer applied systems. And I think you don't get that building specific response that you need from every building performs differently. That's the difficulty in this topic. Even a house that's next to another one or an office that's next to another block could perform completely differently. So I think it's that quick upskill is really important. But from a lot of the discussions that I've been involved with, there doesn't seem to be a recognition of the kind of skills we already have in the industry. And from my perspective, I suppose, as an architect, that's often because architecture is completely misunderstood. And I suppose, to quote Iain, the fact that insulation isn't sexy, I don't think a lot of people realize that architects actually, that's part of the job, that actually you're looking at building physics, you're looking at performance, you're looking at outputs all the time. But it's not the glossy photo on the front of a magazine, and I think that's the understanding of what skills we already have in the industry and the understanding of what actually those roles do and have responsibility for, I think is completely it's untapped and unlocked as well. There's still an upskilling that needs to happen. Not everyone in the industry has those skills, but I think there's a higher level of understanding that we haven't quite recognized yet. So I think there's untapped potential as well.
Absolutely. Jeff?
Yeah, I just add, this is it's uncanny. Catherine Maybe, an academic who did her PhD on this subject, has written a column for our new issue, which is just going to print specifically on tapping into tradespeople from the RMI sector in retrofit. And she acknowledges within the piece that it needs to happen. Every time that Mr. or Mrs. Smith has a leaking roof, and they go to the local builder who they trust, whatever, there's a missed opportunity a lot of the time to upsell retrofit into this. But there's major caveats to apply here, which is that there are risks. And I'm thinking of, for instance, how do I describe this without portraying any confidences? A friend of mine does a lot of expert witness work, and I got a call from them a couple of weeks ago, almost in tears, because they've been called out on an Irish deep retrofit project, I believe a grant-funded project, which had internal insulation, insulated plasterboard with an unventilated cavity behind it, and then solid masonry wall. Triple glazing, heat pumps, standard hole-in-wall ventilation, no air tightness measures, and that was it. Done a couple of years ago, black with mold behind the insulation on every aspect, including the south-facing aspect where you'd expect some sun drying, floors sagging because the joist ends were getting, I presume, wet from the mold growth. There are risks here. So while we need to open it up as much as possible, I think there's a major piece of work required to provide really good, strong, but accessible and digestible upskilling for tradespeople. And we need really, really strong communications. We can't assume that grant funding will be the right way to do this as well, because one thing we know in the past is when you have onerous requirements and grants, in Ireland we've seen this before, you get the cash jobs, a lot of damage being done in cash jobs where people decide, I'm not going to bother with the grants because it's too fiddly, there's great opportunities there, but we have to take real care to ensure that the industry understands that there are such things as building physics. There are right and wrong ways of doing this, and we need to control that message. We almost need the Advertising Standards Authority to be brought up to speed on this and to have real literacy, literacy and enforcement of ensuring that building physics are not flouted in how companies promote their services in this area.
Yeah. Well, just on the back of that, Iain, there was another question that came in, and to kind of piggyback off what Jeff was talking there around. Initially, we were talking about balance. Paul has asked, so balance is important, but is there one area that's more important when it comes to this?
Thanks. That's a good question as well. Nothing's more important than anything else in that heat harm principle balance. Unfortunately, the way things are going at the moment, a lot of people are putting in lots of thermal insulation for internal wall insulation methods, in refurbishment without understanding what else that could bring, the problems of that. So closed cell insulation is fantastic in the right place, but maybe not in refurbishment where it's a solid wall. And it all depends on what that different wall type is and what the benefits are. So what works on one job might not work on the next job. That's the problem. And it's that understanding. How do we get that understanding out to the trade? And going back to Steve, which trade is it? Is it a joiner? Probably it would fit within their package. But, you know, there is the insulation industry is very good. So Insulation Association, there's many good people that understand some of the physics there behind it, that they could actually give advice on what's the best way to refurbish buildings. So there isn't one particular thing that's important, I guess.
Steve, I think you were gearing up to comment on that.
Keira, you know, you've invited me on because I might get myself in trouble, I guess, and here's my opportunity immediately to get myself in trouble. When I grew up, I left school with not a huge number of qualifications and ended up at building college and then on the tools. And you know, since I've been, you know, on site at 19, I was told very early on by people that could, you know, barely count, but they could probably do the pools quite effectively and knew how much a pint cost, that you do certain things to prevent problems, like you don't put vapor checks on the cold side of insulation. You know, you think logically about where water moves through a building. You make sure that if you've got a stop end, that stop end could be serviceable and maintainable, and if it leaks, it's not going to pour water down the back of an external wall insulation, EWI, or any other material. You prevent cracks and breaks, and these are actually, you know, we can overthink this in some degree, because a lot of the major failures in EWI projects, for example, have not been because of anything clever or scientific. It's been detailing. Some of the major problems with internal wall insulation systems, we don't seem to be able to agree about the risk phases associated with timber particle fiber boards and jute and hemp. And actually, there is still not only, if you like, technical differences of point of view, but there also seem to be ethical and kind of fundamental kind of differences that seem to divide people, rather than actually saying there are some basically straightforward principles of moisture management and vapor transfer and condensation, whether it's surface or interstitial, that can be avoided just by adopting basic, simple rules about where you put barriers. So, you know, yes, all right, it's complicated, but it's only as complicated as we want to make it.
Indeed. Christina.
I was just going to come in because I think there's a really interesting thread between those two answers in terms of that balance. And maybe I'm biased because I always have a client, therefore that's always the focus. But for me, the balance tips a little bit to the occupant, to the household, because essentially it's their health, it's their often finance potentially, you know, in terms of who's impacted by this. I mean, if we are looking to upgrade our building stock and really kind of commit to improving the fabric of buildings, and then, you know, look at the application of what technology can do beyond that, then that's future proofing. We're not necessarily even doing it for the occupants of that property or the kind of people who occupy a commercial building at that very moment. It's also about how long that's going to last, you know, protecting that building for future generations as well. So I think the balance tips a little bit to that internal comfort, ensuring health, and also ensuring that the measures that are put in last, because that's also a benefit to those occupants. And that ties into, you know, what was discussed there in terms of even where the vapor control layer goes. And I think, you know, moisture and air and the understanding of, because often when we're specifying things, someone's like, oh, surely we don't need that. We can take it out. We can save that money. And I think there's a professional obligation for the whole industry to understand and empower those whose building it is, say, actually, no, you need this, because if you don't have it in 8 years' time, this could happen. And then with a tolerance factor at the fact that everyone occupies a building differently, so the moisture in buildings, every building, again, they could be next to each other, there could be flats one above the other, moisture is different, therefore there has to be tolerances. But I think for me, the balance tips ever so slightly towards that people-centered approach, because actually if it's people-centered in terms of valuing investment, valuing health, all of that starts to get rolled into that approach.
Jeff, I was going to just ask you a question, actually. You talked a little bit about in situ performance evaluation. So, I mean, can you comment on how do we account for occupant behaviour and, the human thermal comfort as a metric of performance?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's an issue that's been neglected for so long, and you can kind of understand why, because you cut and run and don't ask any questions. If you're not confident of what the answers will be. I've taken a lot of wisdom from talking to, there's a couple of guys, Bill Bordas and Adrian Lehman, who are like pioneers, the kind of grandfathers of post-occupancy evaluation in the UK. They set up an organization called the Usable Buildings Trust, and started evaluating buildings, in the 70s and 80s, and became very unpopular in the industry. And stubbornly unpopular because of the things they were saying, so there's tools we can use to do this. We are seeing recently an explosion of and COVID has certainly helped in this regard of monitoring tools, on things like indoor air quality, indoor environmental quality more broadly, including thermal comfort and so on. And increasingly there's tools you can use as well, systems that integrate interstitial probes if you're doing experimental stuff, and you want to kind of if you're sailing close to the wind, should we say, so some of them we can circumvent some of this by approaches from a detailing perspective that are robust and that are less likely to present issues. But so there are riskier approaches that might need to be taken in certain buildings. I just think in this area, we also need to take account, as Christina said, of occupant needs. I think there's an EN standard we're going to be writing about in the magazine soon called 16798, which sets indoor environmental quality requirements for buildings. And it's fascinating in the sense that it has different thresholds for different occupant types. So vulnerable people, for instance, it has much more stringent, a much narrower band of thermal comfort parameters, and indoor air quality parameters. It requires filtration of supply air from ventilation in virtually every circumstance. And the grade of filtration depends on how bad the outdoor air quality is and how vulnerable the occupants are. So all these things need to be done. But I think there's a piece of work here to kind of. I'm always minded. I mean, Iain said something about this, about the kind of dinner party comment at the start. I'm always minded of there's an episode of Father Ted where Jack gets locked in a pantry or a larder with the most boring priest in the world, this guy who's talking about I think he says, and they have the most interesting, that they have the largest selection of boilers in the world, and I include Canada in that. And you think, I'm that guy a lot of the time, but how you make this stuff interesting and engaging is a real challenge that needs to be tackled. We need to find a way of communicating this through the industry to the new blood of people that we're going to be looking to bring into this space more, whether they're in or out of the industry, and to punters and to consumers, to make them understand that there are great benefits if we do this right, but there are real risks if we do it wrong.
Absolutely. Steve, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that retrofit can be delivered at scale without significantly increasing these types of moisture risks in a large proportion of these properties?
Yes and no, but if you'll indulge me, can I come back just to add to the last question?
Sure.
So as far as occupancy is concerned, you've got four things that cause a moisture imbalance. So we've got thermal performance, more moisture generation, ventilation, and energy inputs. Three of those elements can be variable dependent on occupancy. So the rates, the amounts, the style, all the rest of it. So actually what we've got to try and do, and this brings us on to actually segues nicely onto the next question, can we do this at scale? Yes, we can, but what we have to do is deliver systems and processes and strategies that understand that we've got a number of variables that can knock a building out of moisture balance. So we have to build robustness into that, into the solutions. So they have to be usable. they have to be. I actually believe that we probably have to educate homeowners about how to use, highly energy efficient properties, because they have to use them in a slightly different way. They have to relate to them. They have to maintain them in a slightly different way. You can have a building that its moisture balance is totally critical on the performance of a fan on a cheap motor from China. Essentially, that building can can fall out of balance if that £2 motor starts to cough. So probably a bit more than £2, but you take my point. So to come back to the point, the question you've asked, I think that we have to find a way of delivering retrofit at scale, but we also have to balance that against this robustness and this mechanism for delivering it in a way that people can understand and that has performance robustness built in. Does that make sense? I am rambling a bit, absolutely. But I know what I'm trying to say.
No, absolutely. That's absolutely understood for sure. Iain, I mean, what do you think about the concept of taking, or what would it take to move retrofit off-site, for example? So using the principles of something like, DFMA, Design for Manufacturing Assembly.
Off-site and refurbishment, it's a bit of a problem of marrying the two up, because off-site you think of new build rather than refurbishing. Yeah. Absolutely. So it's what you do in terms of off-site to refurbish buildings. I'm not quite sure how that would actually happen. I would go back to the question or the comment that Steve made about occupants. Our agricultural director, we've got a subsidiary in the agricultural world where we are one of the biggest pig building companies in the UK. Now, our agricultural director, when I used to speak to him about housing, he used to always maintain that the biggest problem with housing is we allow occupants to control their own environment. And obviously you can see where that would come from the pig building industry. You just want to make pigs. When the farmer goes into a pig building, he only wants to see the pig do one of two things, either eat or sleep. And we can't really design buildings for our occupants to do that. Going back to Christina's comment on comfort, when we talk about moisture, the best way to control condensation is to whack the heating up and open the windows. But that's not very energy efficient. You don't get condensation in those types of building, but you've got horrendous heating bills. So sorry, I'm not really answering your original question, Keira.
No, you're fine.
Where offsite fits into that refurbishment side of things, because I'm thinking refurbishment in terms of solid buildings and actually IWI or EWI types of systems, rather than an offsite bringing in. Might be more.
I suppose in terms of offsite, it might be things like smart product solutions, which could be manufactured to an extent so they're easier to apply on site, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it would probably be more in Jeff's Interfit, the sort of deep refurbishment rather than shallow lining of insulation.
Solid walls. Jeff, can you comment on that?
I'm happy to chip in here. Yeah, so there's a bunch of interesting stuff in this area. I mean, the first thing I'd say here is that it kind of depends on what you mean by retrofit, right? And this applies to the arguments that always annoy me about budget and about the cost of retrofit. Most of the projects that we feature, the really deep retrofit projects that we feature, are not just energy retrofits. They're complete remodeling, reimagining the whole space, right? That kind of a project is very different from a project where you're just looking to do a deep retrofit. So there's one that we featured a while ago, which isn't exactly. It's a very interesting because it's not exactly off-site. I mean, there are fascinating off-site kind of approaches like Interfit. Energy Sprung, the Dutch system where they're kind of pre-manufacturing modular retrofit, and you kind of you lift in, you crane in kind of panels. The idea is that you order your retrofit on a Thursday or whatever. The survey is done the next day. You go away for the weekend, and by Monday you've got a net zero house. It's kind of insane with a new roof and wall system and with inbuilt services and so on. It's interesting. I'd like to see some kind of post-occupancy data. It's expensive, but it's an interesting model. But we featured one a while ago, which wasn't off-site per se. It was really interesting. It was an Irish company called Core, insulation manufacturer, who also were a retrofit contractor. And they had a 90-year-old woman in County Cavan, who like a kind of typical Irish granny, if I can be so condescending to say, who had all of the kind of decor and religious paraphernalia that you might expect. It was inside, and she wanted to keep that. They retrofitted her house from like an F or a G rating on our scale up to an A2 rating over, it was about 12 weeks, but all of the works virtually were done externally, external air tightness under the external insulation layer. There was one day they didn't have to decant her. This is the fascinating thing from the house. There was one day where they had to move her from room to room while they were installing new windows. And that, it requires a different attitude from the company as well. You know, the industry that's serving this needs to understand that you are no longer, as one colleague in the space put it, you're no longer a building contractor in the space. You're a home service contractor, and you're working in people's living rooms, hopefully as little as you can. So modular has its attractions, but there are going to be other creative ways of getting there too. You know.
And the only experience I've had with it, I've seen a couple. One of them actually is very close to where I live, where an extension was put up using SIPS panels. Now, the challenge on that job, and thankfully it was a neighbour, so I kind of got involved a little bit because I know the git and he's all right, and you know we get on quite well. Was actually the interface between the existing masonry structure and the SIPS unit. So how do you keep them dry? How do you keep them free of decay? And how do you get thermal continuity between the new and the old? So I think that there is going to be more off-site modular, and there are going to be things that can be done. And I think there's lots of innovation around this space. I think that it should be welcomed, but we again have to be very conscious and careful with those interfaces and that detailing.
Absolutely. And can I just say, there's so many interesting comments coming through on the chat feed from different people. Sorry, Iain, I interrupted you there. Go ahead.
I was just going back to Steve's comment there. I guess the only experience I've had of off-site modular in old buildings would be hotels, where they bring in the pod. Now again, going back to my dinner parties, nobody will be coming to my dinner parties from now on. I get quite excited when my hotel room has a modular bathroom in it. Unfortunately, I don't have the tools to be able to get in the background and see how it works hygrothermally, but it's really quite exciting to see how they've brought in a modular building into an old building. It's very functional. It works great. But I guess that's where you would see the off-site modular coming into hotel rooms. Maybe it's just the hotel rooms I stay in.
I like the concept, Iain, but I don't get excited when I see a modular bathroom in a hotel room. I'm afraid. Now, yeah. Christina, what about the reasons? I mean, why would we want to put off retrofit? Is there any barriers you can see to retrofit?
That's a really good question. Sorry, I'm just laughing because I don't think any of us are ever going to get invited to a dinner party ever again, is what's going through my mind. Oh, there's so many barriers. And I think the biggest one for me is that we've become really separate as an industry to the building occupants. And I know I go on about this all the time. If you've ever heard me talk before, I do beat the same drum, but it's because if anyone who's ever bought a house, it's possibly the most expensive thing you'll ever purchase. Yet we know nothing about them as occupants. We don't know how they function. There's very little information on how you should run them, how you should use them. And I think this taps into a lot of the conversation that's just been happening in terms of, you know, occupancy and different moisture levels and all of that, because actually people don't understand and why should they, in terms of opening windows and the benefits to health. And actually, we just don't talk about it enough. You know, we don't actually we don't think about our buildings making us ill. We don't think about our health in terms of heat and air and moisture. And I think the more people can understand that, I think the more we'll kind of be able to engage with the built environment. And that for me is a really big barrier, because a lot of the conversations with kind of, you know, why would I do that? You know, why is that important? You know, I'll be dead before that happens. You know, all of those things. I think it's actually about, yeah, protecting that building for future generations, actually improving health conditions within that building. You know, all of those things that, yeah, they're just not talked about. So I think that's you know, in my mind, a really big barrier just in terms of actually how we're operating as an industry. And the other is that there is so much skill in the industry, you know, from the installer to the designer to the manufacturers. And I think with the way the industry has evolved, there's a real liability worry in terms of where your line is drawn. And as a result, we don't share information and learn from what we've done in the most collaborative way. And that for me is the biggest barrier to that progress. And I think it's a result of the system. You know, we're all working within our own boundaries of what, you know, as designers, what our, you know, professional indemnity insurance will allow us to. But I think that we're missing that there's not. This isn't just about design. You know, it's interesting listening to the conversation. It's not just about design. It's not just about installation. It's not just about the occupant. It's actually, it's an absolute kit of parts in terms of those that are involved. And I think the overlap of that understanding is key. And that's what's been really missing in the past. You know, it's been product-led, manufacturer-led, contractor-led, design-led, but actually we've got to overlap all those things. So I think there's an education piece in terms of really empowering people to understand their built environment as a whole, as the first thing. And the second is that I just think the industry really needs to kind of break down their own barriers in terms of how on earth somehow we've started to operate, in terms of not talking to each other and not overlapping enough. And if we can break those two things down, I think I think there'd be amazing potential.
Thank you, Christina. Steve, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't wish to sound as though there's any conflict between our points of view, because I think we're actually pretty much on the same page. But you started that piece with, you know, we don't think about buildings and how there are health effects on us. Actually, there is a huge number of people out there where it's absolutely dominating. It dominates their lives, the condition of their buildings and the health effects, or the negative health effects of those buildings. We don't have to look too far at the moment to see examples of that. And the only point I wanted to make is that actually good quality retrofit that brings thermal comfort and reduces energy bills and actually whatever can have a massive effect of improving the lives and the ability for people to live safely in their homes. So, you know, that's part of this piece. Yes, all right, we can sit and pick at the negatives, but actually, you know, buildings that work well for the people that live in them, retrofit energy performance is absolutely central to that, in my view.
Good. So before I interrupted you, just saying there's some great comments coming through on the chat feed, so please keep them coming. Fraser's mentioned, surely the biggest barrier to retrofit is funding. What does the panel think about that? And also he's asked, what does the panel think about past 2035? Will that work in terms of getting to the domestic national targets? Would anyone like to comment on his questions? Jeff's unmuted, so let's go, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, funding. I don't think funding is going to be the barrier that it has been in the past. I think one thing that I take great heart from in this regard is the finance world has radically started shifting. We see a lot in Ireland, initially starting with developers. The EU taxonomy and ESG and environmental, social and governance requirements starting to affect property development finance. That's transforming things. That's going to there are very interesting ideas developing about how to apply this in retrofit as well, to unlock kind of large scale. You do need government certainty. You need long-term political, policy certainty. We have that in Ireland. You don't yet have that in the UK. You've got a very kind of stop-start approach to retrofit, which is not helpful, of course. With regard to, and you have a government as well, I think at times that I'm minded of the famous comments that allegedly came from Dominic Cummings that insulation is boring. and and that it wouldn't win people's votes, just to tie back to the whole dinner party thing we were talking about earlier. But I wouldn't want to be at a dinner party with Dominic Cummings, I'd have to say. But the point is that if you take something like Past 2035, for instance, it's a really solid and considered approach, and that kind of approach does need to be applied. And you fear sometimes where you've got policymakers who are not, where you got ministers jumping around portfolios too often, and their eyes glazing over when you get into the substance of this. You fear that they don't understand it, and they don't look to have these kind of principles applied properly. I think there probably is a case. How do you reconcile Past 2035 on one hand and those requirements against the RMI sector? It's and they need to get people upskilled there as well. How do you involve designers more to because wherever possible, I'm sure Christina would be delighted to hear this, I would certainly give the view that you should try and have designer involvement, if nothing else, but for the fact that that the designer's PI insurance means they're on the hook for like 12 years, is it, or so, after the works are done. Whereas if you go to the man in the van, you've got a year if you're lucky. I think so. I think we do need to take those approaches. Yeah.
Absolutely. Steve?
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different view. Why we got 2035? We got 2035 because we had each home counts. And why did we have each home counts? Is because we'd actually stuffed up the delivery of retrofit right and royally. And so we've got a system in 2035 that is incredibly administratively heavy. So I think the numbers kick about between 35 and 45% of all the cash that's spent on retrofit through 2035 goes on either administration or professional fees. Now, that on the basis of public money is probably okay, because you've actually got some idea that your money's being spent wisely, and you can track it through, and politicians feel good about the fact that allegedly we're delivering quality. For me, as a citizen of the world, if somebody told me that 45 pence of every pound I was going to spend on retrofit was going to go to a consultant, I probably wouldn't spend it. And so 2035 is kind of a well-conceived document, and don't get me wrong, I've kind of got my fingers in it. But would I want, if I was spending money on my house, to have that layer of expenditure and cost associated with the delivery of something that could probably be relatively simple? No, I don't think so. So 2035, yeah, lots of merit, but does it work for the long term? I don't think so, quite honestly. And even if we're looking at these private finance streams that are coming on board, and I think that there's lots of merit in that, I still don't think that 2035 is going to be the requirement. Is going to be a requirement for releasing that funding. I just can't see it.
Thank you, Steve. Nice comment from John here. We've just been brainstorming on a new strapline. We think we might go with making insulation sexy. I think I like that. John, no offence about as much as modular toilets and hotels, but good luck with it. Iain, if I can come to you, please, for a question we've had via email. High fuel bills are driving the desire to carry out energy-saving retrofits. However, given the cost of living crisis and increasing cost of construction materials, how do we prevent cheap retrofit solutions being chosen over those that cost more, but will actually deliver without unintended consequences for the building fabric? Great question.
That's a good question, and again, it's a balance. You've got the energy crisis, and then the cost of living. How do you balance those up? Which is more important? You could be more philosophical and say, well, which is more important, saving energy, saving money, or saving the planet? It's really difficult to know which is the way to go. I think there's lots of different systems out there that can be used for retrofit, and you can choose cost-wise as to what's the most appropriate. But these jobs are not easy. You have to look at each one in its own merits, and we've already spoke about the occupants that are going to be in there. So it's really difficult. I mean, it goes back to the passive side of things. Is it deep retrofit or shallow retrofit. You've got to decide that first, and then you'll decide cost-wise what's going to be more appropriate given the circumstances that we're looking at.
Thank you. And just as another quick question for you, Iain, while you're unmuted, Passive House has its part to play in retrofit. Are you concerned whether this can be rolled out to a mass market?
Yeah, another good question. I like Passive House, and it's got its place in certain areas. I do worry as to whether it could be rolled out for the mass market, not least because of potential assessors to sign off and certify these buildings. I think the principles of it are great, but maybe something more low energy housing that's not got all the ties with it the passive brings, although it's based on good principles. I'm just concerned as to whether it could be done in a mass market side of things.
Thanks, Iain. Christina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. So just for transparency, I'm not Passive House certified or designer, but I am a fan of the principles as a kit of parts, and I would love to undertake the course just further education-wise. But I think a bit like Past 2035, these things exist to provide a framework to push the industry. They provide a standard that's above the basic minimal legal standard, which is our building regulations, to push to a higher level with a level of quality assurance attached that gives comfort in your investment. So I think the industry needs these things, even though they are an isolated commercial venture, but they need these things to push themselves, because if we're relying on the building regulations, then we're building to the basic legal minimum standard, which is just horrendous. So they really help to push everyone, and they get you talking. So I think there are countries in the world that have adopted this decades ago, and actually now that is their norm. So I think we've got a lot to learn, and I think past 2035, the quality assurance is very admin heavy. You're completely right, Steve, but I think in terms of it gives that reassurance. And I can't help when you're looking at a project, and whether it's striving for Passive House, whether it's striving for higher energy standards, whether it's got fancy technology, whichever direction you're going in, the discussion that always comes up is cost. And I think we are so focused on capital cost and what it costs there and then, which goes back to your kind of 45 pence to the pound, for consultants. And obviously, I'm always going to take a different view. But I think the important thing is that's a pound now, but what's the benefit to that building and the occupants and future generations long term? What's the lifetime cost improvement of that investment? And that's when your consultants and your QA really start to come in line, because actually that could double or triple. I mean, it could be anything. So I think the thing is, it's actually looking at things very differently. And that's always hard when it's your own hand going in your pocket, because you can't often see how hard good retrofit is working. It's not a new kitchen, it's not a new bathroom that you can show off. And I think it's because you can't see how hard something's working other than in your fuel, bills, which is why it's again becomes such a kind of hot topic. So when that capital cost is higher and you can't see it, it's a lot harder to digest. But I think going forward in terms of the finance, carrot and stick are going to come into this. It's probably going to be a combination of both. Regulation will have to change in order to deliver net zero and tackle the climate emergency and beyond. So those minimum standards will increase, which will increase costs, which will increase homeowner spend. And I think in terms of looking at houses achieving higher energy performance certificate levels, which is something that's coming in incrementally in both the private, both sides of the industry, essentially, the value of your property will start to link to its performance. Now, that can be quite a scary concept, I think, for any property owner, but that's quite important, because that forms part of that understanding your property and your home package that I was talking about before, because that's quite empowering at the same time as being scary. So I think there will be a bit both carrot and stick in terms of incentives coming through in kind of public money forms, but then also there will need to be private investment in terms of property and ownership.
Thanks, Christina. Jeff, can I come to you just for your comments on this?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I don't think everybody should be forced to build Passive House. It's clearly not realistic, and it's not always going to be appropriate, as I said earlier. I think that when people talk about the likes of passive house principles, it's really important to understand. I mean, Christina kind of touched on this, that one of the reasons why passive house has been successful in terms of looking at, so much post-occupancy data on these buildings is because of the quality assurance, because of the really, really anal attention to detail on evidence gathering. So that kind of approach is something that quality assurance and transparency. How we do this in a more nimble way to keep costs down is an interesting challenge, and I know interesting developments in terms of cloud-based evidence gathering, tools like apps and so on that you can. I mean, which construction operative doesn't have a smartphone these days? So we can record data on buildings, and we should be gathering it in a standardized way, so that the homeowner has a complete access as well, so they understand their building, what's been done to it. That kind of thing, I think, is essential, but it is critical if we're talking about moving away from certified passive house toward, for instance, or from past 2035 full flat kind of towards lighter approaches, that we find ways to ensure that we don't enable people to do massive amount of corner cutting and getting away with stuff, and changing specifications because it's not being certified. Even changing a glazing spec to getting rid of the solar control element that you may need to prevent catastrophic overheating in some cases. These things all need to be properly addressed.
Absolutely, thanks, Jeff.
Keira, would it be all right if I just round my little thought on this?
Please.
I think the whole issue of passive house is absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. You can create a building that's pretty much off grid. It's a bit like the cars on the Formula One grid. They are absolute outliers. They're special. They're test beds. They're things that perform brilliantly, and you can do all sorts of clever things. But actually, when you try to embed that in your kind of your Volkswagen Passat, you're not going to get the same level of performance. But you're going to get a lot of lessons learned from the execution of really high-end retrofit. And actually, if we can get 75% of what you get in retrofit in a normal, I'm not talking about a normal new build, because you push the envelope a bit further, but certainly in retrofit, if you can get to 75% of what can be achieved in passive and EverFit, then absolutely we will solve a lot of our problems. And so perhaps the analogy is not great, but I don't think EverFit passive house is a realistic goal for mass supply, but actually getting a long way close to it would be fantastic.
I mean, even if it was rolled, let's assume or pretend it was rolled out on mass, would there even be enough assessors, Jeff, to look at?
No, not initially, but you don't. It's not like this is just going to come in the morning, is it? You can upscale for these things. We had exactly the same arguments in Ireland back in 2005 when I was in before a parliamentary committee arguing that the state shouldn't be breaching its requirements under the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive to introduce energy rating. They're saying, we can't do it because we don't have the assessors in place to do the work. You can, there's an opportunity, and people will upskill quickly, and they did. I think in new build passive house, the argument really should be a no-brainer, and you kind of alluded to that, Stephen, away to some extent. There are academic studies in Ireland showing passive house projects being built for a University of Ulster study on a project in County Wexford. 0.01% cost uplift compared to building regulations compliance in Ireland to go full on passive house. That's a certified passive house scheme. We've got higher regulations, more ambitious regulations in Ireland, so that kind of helps things. And that was a developer who was cute enough in the Irish kind of lexicon to talk to find ways to do it cost effectively and to pare back the building services spec, as much as needed. And in retrofit, there will be scenarios where it's very cost effective as well. There won't be every building, but if you've got like for instance, a terrace of houses or an apartment building, the cost angle there is completely different to a detached house, for instance, or to a listed building. So each building is different, and the scenarios dealing with are different, and there will be some cases where absolutely it stacks up. But I do think I would really encourage people to look at the AUCB retrofit standards. We're writing about them in the new issue as well, because they're designed in a way to enable people to take practical, pragmatic building physics-based approaches to retrofit now, taking account of the likes of their budgets, using the Pacifist design software and the same kind of methodology essentially, and done in a way that's without locking out future upgrades to the building as well. So what you want to avoid doing is this is one area where the notionally good can be the enemy of the excellent. You don't want to limit the scope to make further improvements to the building that could really transform your life. So that's an important consideration too.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, coming to our last kind of 2 or 3 questions. Iain, obviously Proctor, we do a lot with house builders. Do you have a feel for what should they be considering now? You can find his unmute button.
Sorry, are you talking about
just in general? I mean, thinking of, obviously the discussion today is around retrofit, and Christina mentioned around some of the decisions that are made today almost being counterproductive for the future. We're almost creating our own problem. So I guess I was asking you, what do you think the house builder should be doing differently today for the future?
I think it's an interesting concept to see what's happening in the future. I was with a house builder yesterday, and I was talking about refurbishment. He wasn't very interested because it was his new build. But then I asked, what happens with the new build that they're building now? How's that going to be in 2050? Will they be needing the building that they're building now need to be refurbished in 2050? And I said, how do you actually allow for that? The building that you're building now, to allow for extra insulation to be put in, or improve the air tightness or controls. And what he said was that a lot of the times they're building now, even the affordable houses they're building now, they want to be designed to be net zero ready in the future. So their cupboards, they're building cupboards in there that could house heat pumps in the future if they need to do any refurbishment, which actually brings more questions to your mind. Well, what size is going to be the heat pump in 2050? Is it going to be something that you could do on your watch? So you only need a small area. You don't need a big cupboard to put in your controls, because you don't really know what they can build now for what the future could potentially invent.
Absolutely.
So they're actually trying to put in something that's not actually been invented yet into your buildings. So that's quite a difficult problem for house builders, if indeed they care. But it's difficult to know how they do that, because eventually the fabric will be difficult to improve any further than the fabric is. And then where do you get the energy efficiency from there once you get to that level, which you're bound to be getting to by 2050, you would think?
We'd hope so. We would hope so, for sure. Steve, do you think there's a point at which retrofit becomes counterproductive? And is there any kind of suitable alternatives in your experience?
Oh gosh, when does it become counterproductive? The only time that in my view that retrofit, and we're talking about kind of layering on insulation, becomes counterproductive if it takes a building in the wrong direction. So it causes moisture imbalance at some point. So we've been looking, and I don't wish to open a can of worms, quite carefully over the last year at PU foam, sprayed PU foam in existing roofs, for example. Sometimes it can work great. Sometimes there is no question in my mind that the sprayed PU foam in existing timber roofs can be utterly counterproductive, because actually you look at the U values of the materials set against the ceiling or the pitch, and you look at the moisture profiles and the risk of interstitial condensation, then actually, yes, you can do things that are counterproductive. I also had an experience a couple of years ago with a wooden floor where somebody had put insulation between the ground floor joists and put a solid visqueen sheet to hold the insulation in place. Now, what happened was that the condensation had built up between the driving down into the void rather than coming up through the void, and actually rotted the floor out because it sat there in big wet saggy bags underneath the floor. So as far as you know, can it be counterproductive in respect to risk, moisture risk, structural timbers and the structures that get wet? Yes, absolutely. The only other places that, if you're not very careful, it can be counterproductive is if you haven't got, if you like, a moisture balanced atmosphere as well. So, you know, the ventilation element, which is so well built into 2035, which is absolutely is a great strength of 2035, is fundamentally important. So insulation without ventilation can be very counterproductive in my view.
And how is that managed or policed? I mean, do we wait until the property owner has a problem and then, oh, we shouldn't have put the foam there, we shouldn't have put the visqueen sheet there? How do we actually police that in the industry?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be figuring out how to make my millions. I wish I could tell you. We have a regulated industry in the UK. We have building regulations, we have building control, we have all those checks and balances in place. One could argue that, you know, they don't work as effectively and efficiently as they might do, and there's an awful lot of stuff from heat and light around that whole issue right now. But I honestly, I wish I knew the answer to that. I haven't got it. You know, I'm a great believer in, you know, good people doing the right work for the right price, and everybody gets well out of it. Unfortunately, we know that the world isn't all full of great, bright, shiny people that want to do the right thing for the right price. And that's where it falls on its nose.
Indeed, indeed. Christina, you talked a little bit about education and the gap between, you know, what's happening, what's being communicated. I mean, what do you think, what can professionals be doing and professional bodies be doing to kind of drive this conversation forward for the future?
Yeah, I mean, again, a really good question. And I think it's everyone as well. You know, it's everyone with any knowledge trying to empower everyone around them. You know, we've all got a bit of a sense of responsibility in terms of the climate emergency. But I think from a professional point of view, and you know, having been president of the RIS, I think it's really about opening up that conversation, that pushing that knowledge sharing, and just trying to be as transparent about the information we're finding as much as possible. So you can try and it might end up challenging a method that's been using, but we have to be bold enough and brave enough to say we should not be doing this. You know, percentage wise, we've seen too many problems. And I think also, you know, kind of sprayed PU foam as an example, because it's just come up. How do you take that off? That roof's got a longer life than that foam. So what does the next occupant of that building do? And we're always thinking about, again, it's capital cost, and now it's trying to, I think from a professional body perspective, it's really about, and all of us here, I think it's about trying to shift our mindsets to, it's not about just what we do now and just what it costs now, but actually over 30 years, over 40 years, what does that look like? And how does that benefit the building, the occupant, and almost the industry to a point as well? Because you know, all of those things, if you can take something apart, actually it links to an earlier point that you make here, but actually that becomes more modular. So it might not be off-site, but we might look at doing things in more of a modular way so that they can then be taken apart and redone in a certain way in years to come. And then it ties into also the conversation about new build and future proofing for technology. You know, we don't know what technology is going to be, but we've got a much better idea of what we're going to have to do fabric wise, because the materials industry hasn't changed too dramatically. So I think it's actually about trying to change that conversation that we're all having about what we do right now to actually those long-term effects and benefits. And I think it also changes the conversation about cost and investment, because you're not looking at that short term, you're looking much more holistically. And that brings in the cost of living crisis, because there are a lot of people very quickly all of a sudden trying to get photovoltaics, but if they'd done it 10 years ago, you know, so I think it's just that long-term effect, and energy prices definitely are assisting that conversation. Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there.
No problems at all. And Jeff, you wanted to add to something there?
I just think I think we need really strong leadership from from government, from the professional institutions, from from anybody involved in education related to construction. And what we need, and one of the things that I think is sorely missing, is a recognition that there are such things as truths, the actual singular truths in this area. I am sick to the teeth of having conversations with architects, for instance. And I don't want to single out architects for criticism here, over how it's not healthy to have an airtight building because you need your building to be breathable. Fundamentally misunderstanding, because that's partly down to the terminology. It's kind of a bit grosser, but I would prefer the term sweatable for that reason. If you're looking for a simple term, so there's a lot of noise, and everybody's got an opinion, and a lot of people are kind of not great at subjecting theirs to scrutiny or to So, we need peer review. We need a complete reform of CPD. I think, for instance, within the professional institutions, that would be a major way of doing it. And we need a recognition, and a messaging campaign that involves government, involves professional bodies, and so on the fundamental principles that have to be observed here, the right ways to do this, and to spread that message as far and wide as we can to stop the nonsense being tolerated anymore. Sorry. Sounded curmudgeonly and grumpy. Yeah.
Good. And I think Scotty W just raised a really good point on understanding in terms of how are we supporting the trades through CPD, small businesses and smaller subbies in providing to the trades at the sharp end. So we've talked an awful lot today around, the specifiers, the detailing, and of course that applies to on-site as well. But I think it's quite a good point. How do we get to the sharp end of the people that are actually doing the work, to see if it well or not well, as you kind of quite rightly pointed out there. Christina, please, yeah.
I mean, I'm quite lucky, I think, in this respect, because we work quite closely with contractors. So if we're trying to do something new, we're on the same journey. And I think that's really important. So we've learned about how it looks on a drawing and how it should go together. And we're having that conversation, and there's learning and making and doing on site. And I think that connectivity is really important. There's also some great initiatives popping up. There's a centre in Scotland called BEST, Built Environment Smart Transformation, who are running courses for, professionals, for contractors, for installers, public, anyone. So you can learn about retrofit and taping and air tightness, and and I think things like that are just absolutely critical, and really, really helping. But I think that installation, someone can draw something till they're blue in the face, but if it's installed wrong, that's it. So I think it's about transparency, communication. It's about working together, but also that skill is critical. And I think there's a different value on that as well. And I think in terms of the industry, this, people aren't coming through as apprentices as much anymore. Numbers are dropping off. But actually, this is exciting. This is kind of forefront stuff in terms of building. And I think reframing that and showing the opportunity and the skills required, I think, is a big opportunity in that.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel as well some onus should be put on the manufacturers. So obviously, Proctors, we're a manufacturer. We offer things like toolbox talks. We go to site. We have installation apps. We have installation videos. So I think the whole concept of just selling, a manufacturer making and selling a product to the industry and then wiping their hands of it, that also needs to be overcome. Iain, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just basically touching on Scotty W's comment there about CPDs. You have to keep up to grips with technology as best you can. There's fundamentals here. Like the old fundamental is the airtight layer must go on the inside of the building, and then you tape it up, and that's how you get an airtight building. But yet you now have vapor permeable membranes that are airtight, and they go on the outside of the building, where traditionally your vapor permeable breather membrane, sorry, Jeff, goes on the outside, but this breather membrane can also be airtight as well. So that technology is always evolving and coming up with better solutions for certain areas. And it's that teaching of that new technology through CPDs and areas like that people will get the better educated. And going back to your toolbox talks that you mentioned there, Keira, we do that, and we find it very successful on sites. When we go there on site, We tell the tradesmen, this is how you do it, this is how you install it. And they go through the learning curve, and they're very receptive to it, you know. Probably the younger ones more than the older ones, but it's very receptive.
Jeff had your hand up there, sorry.
Well, just a quick one. It's really interesting from a manufacturer's perspective here. I think CPD is in major need of overhaul, and I think regulation of CPD to ensure that the value of the information that whether it's whichever kind of area of the industry this is going towards, the value of it and the consistency of it technically, the accuracy of it is right. How would that affect you as a manufacturer if you were to if you were if you were kind of more quite restricted in that sense as to what you could kind of, would the value, surely the value of the CPD would be enhanced in that that the people who are undergoing it understand that this information is in a sense more credible than maybe has been the case. I'm not having a go at Proctor at all in this regard. I just mean, I see very variable CPD in the industry, and there's got to be a way to make it more valuable for everyone.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of us as a manufacturer, sorry, Iain, we have different types of CPDs, which I should let Iain, because I'm the host, I'm going to let Iain answer that one. Go ahead.
Oh, hopefully I'll answer the same way you did, Keira. But yeah, it's a great point, Jeff. We've all experienced CPDs where you sit down and you think this is going to be educational, and it's a sales pitch, and that's the worst ever, that you get switched off very quickly and it's just a sales pitch. We'd like to think that our CPDs are not sales pitches. We go more fundamental than that, and indeed we have a suite of REBA approved CPDs where it's actually to the extreme that you're not allowed to speak about your products. So it's more educational in principles that we go for there. And we find that very useful. I would say the CPDs we do, refurbishment is one of our CPDs that is very popular, because new build, most people know how to do new build. They know how to do timber frame. They know how to do modular, but refurbishment is so interesting. And going back to the dinner party situation, but it's so interesting for a lot of people that you do get a lot of people coming to the CPD because they want to learn about all the different difficulties and challenges of refurbishment. So yeah, that's where we do the CPD side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Fraser's comment, a lot of CPD offerings are thinly disguised products adverts. And I would agree with that to an extent at times. And I think that completely depends on what type of manufacturer you are. So if you're a manufacturer like Proctor, some of the other very credible and fantastic manufacturers that are providing products to the industry, they're very much doing what Steve described earlier, trying to make sure that people are doing things right, installing them correctly, doing things for the greater good, and not just trying to get kind of en masse sales. So I suppose as a business for us, we really do care about how the industry is doing things, the building physics of these buildings, and it's not just about selling product. Steve, did you have some comments?
Yeah, just a couple of observations really. I think at the top of today's presentation, you gave some figures about how many of these you've done this year and what your login rates were. That surely is the best indication that you're providing successful CPD that resonates with people. If you were simply out here pitching products, that wouldn't happen. We provide CPD across the year. We do one a month at least, probably 10 a year. And for exactly the same reasons, we've got what can only be described as a really surprisingly large and diverse audience. It's about the quality of what you do. So even though to some degree, Jeff, I kind of hear what you're saying about making sure that CPD is of a reasonable quality, and that professional people shouldn't be claiming CPD accreditation or points or adding these things up if there is no merit in the product that they're sitting to view. But actually, most people will be quite discerning, and they will switch off very quickly to somebody who's feeding them nonsense. And actually, the people that build credibility by providing decent products will soon get an audience. And I think that's one of the few good things about the electronic age, is that people become quite discerning quite quickly if you're producing rubbish.
Christina.
I think there's an opportunity as well, because both product manufacturer and installer can benefit from shared experience in that regard. So we always often think of CPD as kind of a presentation, or kind of going back to school being taught something, but actually listening to someone else's experience using that product, or how they cut it, or how complex it was at that steel junction because it was the first time they'd ever come across something like that. And I think that feedback to the manufacturers, but then also just that industry sharing, is really important. And I think that's an aspect of CPD that often gets misunderstood. Contractors don't necessarily talk to the contractors about the pros and cons of doing it, how that actually they got themselves that specific tape, actually they ended up getting tied up in it because it was sticky on both sides and they didn't realize. All these little nuances of shared experience, I think, can help all parties, and it can really it's almost like sometimes it can be informal CPD, but I think also the kind of you can make that conversation formal in terms of a more professional knowledge sharing sphere as well. And I think all parties benefit from things like that.
Good. Totally agree, Christina. Thank you. And Iain, can I just ask you to make a comment here? Andrew said that he's seen products like the excellent Wrap Tight, badly detailed, so it's compromised. And I guess this happens with a lot of the internal airtight measures. So this can apply to a lot of products, not just Wrap Tight. So without training at the installer level and fit for purpose supervision, all the technology in the world won't help, I think he's trying to say. Have you got some feedback on that, please?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the point's already been made this morning that we don't build on a drawing board, and you can have the most fantastic products, of which the difficulty is how to install it properly and the way it's designed to be installed. And that's what our toolbox talks do. Going back to Steve's point on our webinars, the St. Sidwell's point, we did a webinar on that recently, where it was passive house swimming pool, and it was very much viewed by a lot of people to get general principles of passive house and the fact that it was a swimming pool. So it's very educational for them. It was some architects who were involved, in the contractors, giving their experience from it. So it wasn't just a sales pitch. So yeah, you have to install it correctly. There are some really good products out there, but if you install them badly, then you're going to have problems.
I mean, that case study, just to answer Andrew's question, is if you haven't watched that, have a look on our YouTube and go and find it. It's a great example of where the contractor took a huge amount of responsibility, along with the designing architects, around installation practices and the culture of how that project was managed on site, in terms of training, support to the work team. And that is exactly why they managed to achieve the levels of performance that they did. So I think whilst the onus is on education and CPDs and installation and things like our app and our installation videos and our technical salespeople, which help with all that, I think really what worked on that particular project was the responsibility and the accountability taken by the contractors on site. And it's a great example. So please go and have a look if you can.
I think I would say that the St. Sidwell's point, one of the contractors made the point that during that process, they wanted to install something and it was a problem. And we were able to solve it with a stick pin, which is very simplistic. I was trying to find it. I usually have them lying about. Again, going back to my dinner parties. But it was a very simplistic stick pin, maintained the airtight layer, but allowed you to fix this outer membrane through the insulation. And it was great education on the webinar that the client and the contractor was talking about. This solved the problem very simplistically. So yeah, it was a great example of how you can work together if you're given a problem.
Good. I think Paul's commented, that the relevant knowledge is required to assess the manufacturer-led CPD. Absolutely agree. And I think the difference between different manufacturers' CPDs, they're vast. And our goal is to self-regulate. Yes, it is. So please have a look at our website, www.proctorgroup.com. No, I'm only kidding. So thank you very much.
Sorry, the stick pin was also, I've managed to find it. That was the stick pin, and you don't get that from Proctor's. So we were recommending a product that wasn't from Proctor's. It might be in our range in the future, but we were helping out the contractor with something that we don't sell, which we do quite often, that we give them what's best and appropriate for the job rather than what we sell.
Good. Well, that's us come to the end of the questions, and I just want to say I really enjoyed that today. Thank you so much to the panel for your input this week. I think some really interesting comments around the whole topic of retrofit, and to be fair, we could probably go on forever, but I'm conscious that we're now quite a while past our 11 o'clock deadline, so thank you for staying on and your time as well. It's been really appreciated. Love the interaction on the YouTube feed, so thank you for your comments, and nice to see people interacting and discussing different topics around this. So we'll be back in 2023 doing our monthly webinars on different topics each month. Our next one date for the diary is Friday the 27th of January at the usual time of 10 o'clock. I don't have the topic exactly, but I believe it's around a specification-based case study. So I apologise, I didn't make a note of that. We do have it planned, but for once I don't have the note of that, so apologies. So thank you all for joining. I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Enjoy the break. We have a cost of living crisis and a bit of recession to face next year, so we need to all come back fighting fit, ready for that. And can I just thank the panel once again for your time? We really appreciate it. So thanks for coming and have a good weekend.